Good day, everyone, and welcome back to Coolsears Art School's online class. Today, we will be learning about science for primary 5. But before we start, I would like to introduce myself again. What's my name? My name is Teacher Layla. Can you repeat again? Teacher Layla. So in today's topic, we will continue our discussion about living things in the environment. But before we start, I would like you to grab your Inside Out Science 5 book and turn it to pages 12 to 17. Again, grab your Inside Out Science 5 book and turn it to pages 12 to 17. Do you already have your books with you? If yes, then let's start. Now, before we move on to our lesson proper, I would like to give you an overview of the things that we are going to discuss in this video. For the part 1 of this video, we are going to discuss what is food chain. Under this one, we are going to discuss what are the different functions of food chain. Furthermore, we will also discuss the difference between a producer and a consumer. And under our topic about consumer, we are going to discuss the 3 types of consumer. For the part 2 of this video, we will have an experiment, and this is about greenhouse making. For the third part of this video, we are going to discuss what is food web. And for the last part of this video, we are going to discuss what are decomposer and what are its importance in an environment. First off, what is a food chain? Now let us define what is a food chain. Food chain is defined as a linear network of links in a food web starting from producer organisms and ending at apex predator species, detritivores or decomposer species, which are also known as consumers. Furthermore, it is also defined as a system where a small animal is the food for a larger animal, which in return is the food for an even larger animal. So I want you to take note of this underlined text right here. It says they're a linear network. When we say linear network, it is a one-line network link in a food web. Later in this video, we will discuss what is a food web, starting from producer organism. Now, let me give you an overview on what is a producer. A producer organism example includes a plant because a plant makes its own food. And this plant serves as food to other organisms. Now, we also have there the word consumer. When we say consumer, these are the organisms or the animals that eat the producer. Okay, now let's proceed. And lastly, it also says here that a food chain shows how the organisms are related with each other by the food they eat. Okay, so food chain will give you or will explain to you the interrelation of the different organisms in an environment and how they are related based on what they eat. Now, let us discuss the different functions of a food chain. So, the food chain has 3 main functions and they are as follow. The first one, food chain can be used to show what living things in an environment feed on, which we already discussed a while ago. We said that in a food chain, a food chain is basically the relationship of the different organism and an environment based on what they eat. Now, the second function of a food chain is that it shows how energy is transferred from one living thing to another. And the last function of a food chain is that it can be used to describe the feeding relationship among animals, which is basically just the same with the first one. Now, we have here an example of a food chain. A food chain always begins with the producer and ends with the consumer. Now, remember that we've mentioned this a while ago in the definition of a food chain. Again, when we say producer, this includes your plants, and consumers are always animals. Now, in this picture, you can see there the grass, which is the producer in this food chain. We also have there the grasshopper, which eats the grass. So the grasshopper is regarded as the consumer, and then a rat, which eats the grasshopper, and the owl, which eats the rat. Now take note that the arrow pointing on the right side in a food chain means eaten by. Okay, so the grass is eaten by a grasshopper, the grasshopper is eaten by a rat, and the rat is eaten by an owl. Okay, so take note of this arrow right here. Okay, now we have here another example of a food chain. I have here with me a leaf or a leaves, which is an example of a plant which is a producer. And we have here a caterpillar which feeds on the leaves. Therefore, the caterpillar is considered as a consumer. And then we also have here a chameleon. Now, chameleon eats the caterpillar. Now, the chameleon is also an example of a consumer. Now, I hope that it's already clear to you what is a food chain and what is the difference between a producer and a consumer. Okay, so we have there the leaves, the caterpillar, and the chameleon. Okay, now let's define what is a producer and a consumer. What is the difference between these two? When we say producer, again, it is an organism that serves as a source of food for other organisms in a food chain. Another definition of producer is that it is an organism, either a green plant or bacterium, which is part of the first level of a food chain. So remember, we've mentioned a while ago that a food chain always starts with a producer. And an example of a producer is a plant. Now, plants are called producers. Why? Because they can produce their own food through photosynthesis. Now, if you will go back to our previous lesson, we've mentioned there that plants make their own food through photosynthesis and they do not depend on other organisms for them to make their own food or for them to be alive, but other organisms actually depend on them for food, just like the consumers. Okay? So this is what a producer is. Remember, producer is always the first level in a food chain. An example of this, again, is a plant because they make their own food through the process called photosynthesis. Now, what is a consumer? If a producer is the one that produces food for other consumer or other organism, the consumer is what consumes the producer. Okay, so a consumer is an organism that feeds on plants or other animals for energy. There are four kinds of consumers. We have the herbivores or the plant eaters, we have the carnivores or the meat eaters, we have the omnivores or the plant and animal eaters, and we have the detritivores or the decomposers. So remember, in our previous lesson about living things in an environment as well, we studied there the different or the three classification of animals based on what they eat. Okay, remember that a lion is a carnivorous animal because it eats other animals. An elephant is a herbivorous animal because it only eats plants. And a rat is an example of an omnivorous animal because it eats both plant and animal. Okay, so this is a consumer. A consumer basically is the one that eats the producer. Now, animals are called consumers as they can only get energy from consuming other plants or other animals. Okay, unlike plants, animals cannot make their own food. They do not undergo photosynthesis. That's why they cannot be called producers because they just depend on plants for their food. Okay, now we have here the three types of consumer. What are they? The first one is a primary consumer. A primary consumer is an animal that feeds on plants. The second type of consumer is a secondary consumer. A secondary consumer is an animal that feeds on primary consumer. And then we have the last type of consumer, which is a tertiary consumer. A tertiary consumer is an animal that feeds on a secondary consumer. Now, This is an example of a food chain that shows a producer and the three types of consumer. We have here the grass as the producer. We have there the grasshopper as the primary consumer because the grasshopper eats the grass, so he is regarded as the primary consumer. And then we have the rat as the secondary consumer because the rat eats the primary consumer. And then we have the owl, which is a tertiary consumer because he eats the secondary consumer, which is the rat. Okay, so this is what we mean by producer and the three types of consumer. Okay? Now, we have here another example of a food chain, okay, for you to better understand what is a food chain. Now, in this food chain, you can see there the grass again as the producer. And then we have the grasshopper as a primary consumer because this grasshopper eats the grass. And then we have the bluebird, which is a secondary consumer because he eats the grasshopper. And then we have there the snake, which is the tertiary consumer because he eats the bluebird. And we have the apex predator, which is the biggest or the end point of a food chain. Usually, an apex predator is the biggest among of all the predator in a food chain. And lastly, we have the decomposer, okay? We will know further more about decomposer as we move on in our video, okay? For your science experiment, we will be building a greenhouse. But since we are just doing online class right now, what I want you to do is to actually just watch this YouTube link down below for you to understand what we mean by greenhouse making. And once you come back from school, we will do it all together. I hope you enjoy watching, okay? Now let's proceed to the third part of this video, which is about food web. Now, what is a food web? Food web is defined as a system of interlocking or interdependent food chains. So in the first part of this video, we studied about food chains. And when we say food chains, again, it is a linear relationship of the different organism and an environment based on their feeding habits. Okay. Now, in another definition, food web is a natural interconnection of food chains and graphical representation of what eats what in an ecological community. Another name for food web is consumer resource system. So basically, when we say food web, it's just a series of food chains. So in a food web, we can either have 2 or 3 or more food chain. A living thing can belong to more than one food chain. We have here an example. Grass can be eaten by grasshoppers and rabbit. Now remember that we've mentioned a while ago that a grass is an example of a producer and this rabbit and grasshopper are consumers. Now this grass serves as food to a number of different animal species, okay? Not only rabbit and grasshopper, but grass is also eaten by other animals just like goat and sheep. Now, other animals that eat grasses include sheep, zebra, and deer. Okay, now, let's have here an example of a food chain. So, for our producer, we have there the grass, which is eaten by a grasshopper. Now, this grasshopper, which is a primary consumer, is eaten by a rat, which is a secondary consumer. Now, this rat is eaten by the owl, which we can regard as the tertiary consumer. Now, this owl can be eaten by a snake, which is the apex predator. Now, this links right here or interconnection right here is an example of a food chain. Now, what makes a food web? When we say food web, again, it is a series of food chain, meaning in a food web, we can find more than one food chain. Now, we have here the grass again as the producer, which is eaten by a rabbit, which is the consumer, and the rabbit is eaten by the snake, which is regarded as the secondary consumer. Now, the grass and rabbit-snake relationship is another food chain. So in this diagram right here, you can see there that we already have two food chain. The first one is grass, grasshopper, rat, owl, and snake. Now the second food chain is grass, rabbit, and snake. Now, when the rabbit is eaten by the hawk, we have there another type of food chain, grass, rabbit, and hawk. Now, when the snake is eaten by the hawk, we have there another food chain. We have there the grass, rabbit, and snake, and hawk food chain. And when the rat is eaten by the hawk, we have there another food chain from the grass, grasshopper, rat, and hawk. So in this food web, we can see there are 5 food chains, okay? So this is what we mean by a food chain. A food web. It is made out of 2 or more food chains, okay? Now let's think. If there are more owls in the environment, what will happen to the number of grasshoppers? I want you to do a research on this one and answer it during our Zoom meeting, okay? Now, we have here another example of a food web in an aquatic environment. Now, we have here the phytoplankton, which is the producer in this food web. Now, the phytoplankton is eaten by the zooplankton. Now, the zooplankton is eaten by the fish, and the fish is eaten by a seagull. Now, the seagull is eaten by a leopard seal, okay? Now, that is an example of one food chain. Now, in another food chain, we have there the phytoplankton, which is eaten by a krill. Now, the krill is eaten by a blue whale. So, that is the second food chain. Now, we have here another series of food chain, which is the seaweed as the producer. Now, we have there the crab, which ate the seaweed. Now, the crab is eaten by the squid, and the squid is eaten by the penguin, and the penguin is eaten by the leopard seal. Now, there are 3 food chains in there already. Now, the seaweed is eaten by the crab and the squid, and the elephant seal ate the squid, and the killer whale ate the squid. So as you can see in that relationship, we already have 4 food chains. And now lastly, we have there a phytoplankton, which is eaten by a zooplankton, which is eaten by a fish, which is eaten by a seagull, which is eaten by a blue whale, which is eaten by a leopard seal, and which is eaten by a killer whale. And then we have there 5 food chains. Now, when you combine all of this food chain together, and you will and when you combine all of these food chains together, they will then create a food web. Now, we have here another example of a food web in a grassland environment. So, we have there the green plant as the primary producer. Now, this green plant is eaten by a rabbit. Now, the rabbit is eaten by a wildcat, and the wildcat is eaten by a lion, okay? Now, that is already one series of food chain right there. Now, in another example, we have there the green plant, which is eaten by the mouse. Now, the mouse is eaten by the owl. So, that is an example of a food chain again. Now, we have another example. We have there the green plant, which is eaten by the goat, and the goat is eaten by a jackal, and the jackal is eaten by the lion. Okay, so that is another series of food chain. Okay, so when all of this food chain combine together, they will form a food web. Now, remember that in a food chain, in a food web, there is always a producer, which is the plant, and there's always the consumer, which are the animals, okay? And the apex predator, or the biggest predator, or the biggest consumer out of all the animals. In this case, the lion. Now, we have here the difference between a food chain and a food web. On the left-hand side of your screen, you can see there the food chain. Now, in the food chain, you can see there the plant, which is an example of, again, what do you call a plant? Again, a producer. And then we have there the deer as the consumer. And then we have the lion as the secondary consumer. Now, this lion, when it dies, it will eventually be eaten by decomposers. Okay, now let's discuss decomposer as we go further. Now, on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see there a food web. Again, a food web is a series or a combination of the different food chains, okay? So we have there the grass as the producer, the grasshopper, the snake, the eagle, the kookaburra, and the mouse, okay? So this is the difference between a food chain and a food web. A food chain is basically a simple linear relationship of animals and organisms or plants in an environment. Now, a food web is a combination of different food chains, okay? I hope that you already understand the difference between a food chain and a food web. Now, for the last part of our video, we will discuss what are decomposers. So let's define what are decomposers. Decomposers are living things that feed on dead plants and animals. Decomposers turn dead matter into nutrients by a process called decomposition. So I want you to take note of this one, decomposition. It is the process wherein decomposer turns dead matter into nutrients. Now, decomposers are also consumers. Why? Now, we have here the different examples of decomposers. This includes the bacteria, fungi, some insects, and snails, which means they are not always microscopic. So remember, if we will go back to our picture a while ago of a food chain, you can see in here that these are decomposer, okay? So, food chain starts with a producer, okay, which is the plant. We have there the deer, which is the plant. Now, the deer is eaten by a lion. Okay, now eventually when this lion dies, it will be eaten by a decomposer, which in this case is the mushroom or the fungi. That's why we mentioned that the decomposer are also example of consumers because they do not make their own food and they only depend on dead matter like plants and animals for their food where they turn it into nutrients, okay? Now, let's go back, okay? So we have here the different examples of decomposer. This includes your mushroom, which is a fungi. We have your earthworms. We have your fly, which is an insect. And we have your bacteria, okay? Now, what do we mean when we say microscopic? So we have here one trivia. A microorganism or microbe are microscopic organisms so tiny which cannot be seen by the naked eye. An example of this one includes bacteria, fungi, and virus. When we say microorganisms, these are tiny, tiny, tiny living things which cannot be seen by the naked eye. In order for us to see this microorganism, we need to subject them under a microscope for us to be able to see them, okay? Now, in this example, the decomposer, an example of a microorganism in there is the mushroom, which is a fungi, and the bacteria. Actually, this bacteria right here is a microscopic image, okay? So we cannot see bacteria by just looking at something, okay? You need to subject them under a microscope, okay? Now, let's proceed. What is the importance of decomposers in an environment? So, decomposers are like the housekeepers of an ecosystem. Without them, dead plants and animals would keep piling up with the nutrients the soil needs trapped inside. Now, decomposers are also the ones that clean up the dead material by processing it and returning the nutrients to the soil for the producers. Okay, so these are the different functions of a decomposer. Now, this decomposer eats the dead plants and animals and then turns it into nutrients. Now, the nutrients gets left behind the soil, which the plants absorbs as it grows. Now, when the plant is fully grown, other animals or the consumer will actually eat the plant, okay? So, this is how important decomposers are in an environment, okay? In the next video, I have prepared there a video which will discuss decomposer And I hope that you watch carefully so that you will better understand our topic about it.
Math and types of decomposers. In this video, we will look at several types of decomposers. A decomposer is an organism that breaks down dead or decaying organisms. Decomposers help recycle matter in an ecosystem by breaking down decaying or dead organisms. Take a look at this banana. Like other consumers, decomposers are heterotrophic, meaning they use other organisms to get their energy, carbon, and nutrients for growth and development. We will focus on four main types of decomposers: fungi, insects, worms, and bacteria. Fungi break down and recycle organic material by pre-digesting. Fungi produce enzymes that break down and digest decaying and dead matter, and then absorb this material. This process depends on water. Therefore, most fungi are found in moist areas. Check out these examples of several fungi. Are also decomposers. They play a very important role in producing our soil. Earthworms help decompose organic material and help make nutrients like phosphate more readily available. Check out these earthworms at work. Bacteria are tiny organisms, and they could be considered the kings of decomposition. Bacteria are found almost everywhere and every object on planet Earth. They help release important nutrients that living organisms have absorbed, and they release these nutrients back into the environment, like nitrogen and phosphorus. Several insects like flies, dung beetles, maggots, and ants are decomposers and break down once living organisms. Check out this dung beetle. Dung beetle. Scientists recognize several major groups: those that feed on dead or dying plant tissues, those that feed on dead animals, and those animals like the dung beetle that feed on the excrement of other animals. Take a look at these insects that are decomposers. The different types of decomposers.
So that video shows the different types of decomposers. Now let's proceed. Now we have here another example of a food chain that includes the decomposer. So remember this one a while ago. We said that the grass is the producer, the grasshopper is the primary consumer because it feeds on the grass. And then we have there the bluebird, which is the secondary consumer, which is the grasshopper. And then we have the snake, which is the tertiary consumer because it eats the bluebird. And then we have there the owl, which is an apex predator. Now when this owl dies, it will eventually decompose, which will be eaten by decomposers such as fungi, bacteria, insects, or worms. Okay, now from this decomposers right here, okay, they will turn the dead plants and animals that they've eaten into nutrients. Now the nutrients again will be left out from the soil and be absorbed by the plants again. So basically this food chain is just a cycle where we have the producer, consumer, and the decomposer. Now we have here another example that shows how decomposers work in an environment. Okay? So that concludes our discussion about food chain and food web. I hope that by now you already understand what are its difference. Now if yes, let us proceed to answering your yellow book. But first off, I want you to grab your yellow book and write there activity 2. Write there your name, your class number, the date today, and leave a space for your score because we will check it during our Zoom meeting. Okay, number it 1 to 10. Now, for the first part of this activity, we have there multiple choice. I want you to write the question and choices and circle the letter of the best answer. Again, I want you to write the question, okay? Don't just write there A, B, C, D, okay? I want to see the question and the choices, and you will circle the letter of the correct answer. I don't want to see their X, okay? I only want to see circle. Okay, so let's start. For number 1, blank is a linear network of links in a food web starting from producer organisms and ending at apex predator species or the consumer. What is it? Again, blank is a linear network of links in a food web starting from producer, organisms, and ending at apex predators species such as or the consumer. What is it? Is it letter A, food chart, letter B, food chain, letter C, food web, or letter D, food pyramid? Is it letter A, food chart, letter B, food chain, letter C, food web, or letter D, food pyramid? For number 2, blank is an organism, either a green plant or bacterium, which is part of the first level of a food chain. Again, blank is an organism, either a green plant or bacterium, which is the first part or of the first level of food chain. Is it letter A, consumer, letter B, prey, letter C, producer, or letter D, predator? Again, is it letter A, consumer, letter B, prey, letter C, producer, or letter D, predator? For number 3, blank is an animal that feeds on a primary consumer. Again, blank is an animal that feeds on a primary consumer. Is it letter A, consumer, letter B, secondary consumer, letter C, primary consumer, or letter D, tertiary consumer? For number 4, okay, for number 4 onwards, we have their directions, true or false. Write T if the statement is true or correct, and write F if the statement is false or incorrect. Write your answer before the number. Again, I only want to see letter T and letter F in there, okay? Don't write true or the word true or the word false, okay? And copy the question. Don't just write T and F in there. I want to see the question or the statement, okay? And write your answer before the number. Now for number 4, blank animals are called consumers as they can only get energy from consuming plants or other animals. Again, animals are called consumers as they can only get energy from consuming plants or other animals. Is it true or is it false? Number 5, food web is a system of interlocking and interdependent food chains. Again, food web is a system of interlocking and interdependent food chains. Is it true or is it false? Write your answer in your yellow book. Now for number 6, decomposition is the process where decomposers turn dead plants and animals into nutrients. Again, decomposition is the process where decomposers turn dead plants and animals into nutrients. Is it true or is it false? Again, write your answer in your yellow book. And for number 7 to 8, okay, we have their direction, enumeration. Give what is asked. Again, give what is asked. For number 7 and 8, it says there, give 2 types of decomposer. So remember that we've discussed about decomposer and we gave there 4 example of decomposer. For number 7 to 8, I only want you to give 2. Okay, give at least 2 example of decomposer. And for number 9 and 10, we have their illustration. Draw a simple food chain. Your food chain must contain the producer, the consumer, and the decomposer. I don't want it to be very long, okay? It can only compose of like 3 animals or 3 consumers, okay? But don't forget to write there your producer or to include there your producer, your consumer, and your decomposer, okay? This is for 2 points for number 9 and 10, okay? Now, for your homework, you can answer activity 4 on your Inside Out workbook, okay? For additional information about our topic, watch the YouTube link, which is this one. This YouTube link is about our topic, food chain and food web. If you have extra time, you can watch this one, okay? Now, before we end our discussion, let's have a recap of the things that we've discussed for today. So we discussed the animals in the environment. Under this one, we discussed food chain. Now, what is food chain again? Food chain is a linear network of links in a food web starting from producer organisms and ending at apex predator species, detritivores or decomposer species, or your consumer. Now, under food chain, we studied the different functions of food chain. The first one is that food chain can be used to show what living things in an environment feed on. The second function of a food chain is that it shows how energy is transferred from one living thing to another. And the last function of food chain is that it can be used to describe the feeding relationship among animals. Under food chain, we also studied producer. Again, producer includes your plants because they make their own food through photosynthesis. And consumer. The consumer consists of the different animals because unlike plants, they cannot make their own food. Under consumer, we also studied the 3 types of consumer. We have the primary consumer, which feeds on producer. We have the secondary consumer, which feeds on the primary consumer. And we have the tertiary consumer, which feeds on the secondary consumer. Now, we also discussed about the food web. What about food web? Food web is a system of interlocking and interdependent food chains. So again, when we say food web, it basically just composed 2 or more food chains. And lastly, we also discussed about decomposers. Again, decomposers are organisms that feeds on dead plants and animals and turn it into nutrients. Example of this one include your fungi, your bacteria, your worm, and your insects, okay? So that ends our discussion about living things in the environment. I hope that you've learned a lot, and don't forget to do your homework and your yellow books, okay? And I'll see you again in our next meeting. Again, this has been Teacher Layla for Cool Start School's online class. Bye, class!